The cold bit through Catherine Reed's threadbare shawl as she clutched her sleeping 6-year-old son closer. The dying embers of their campfire offering nothing but false hope against the merciless Wyoming winter of 1873. Her trembling fingers hovered over the last flickering coal, their final defense against the darkness that threatened to swallow them both. Catherine had fled west after her husband's death, chasing whispers of land and opportunity. The promise of a teaching position in Silverpine had drawn her from Pennsylvania with little James, and what few possessions they could carry. But the stagecoach had been attacked by bandits 2 days prior, the driver killed, and Catherine and James left stranded miles from anywhere, with only the clothes on their backs and her husband's old revolver. She'd managed to build a fire that first night, remembering how Thomas had shown her during their brief camping trips before the war took him. But by the second day, exhaustion had overtaken her, and now, as night fell once more, the fire had died while she dozed fitfully against a boulder. James's small body curled against her side. The sound of approaching hoofbeats jolted Catherine awake. She fumbled for the revolver hidden in the folds of her skirt, her heart hammering against her ribs. A lone rider emerged from the darkness, his form gradually taking shape against the starlit sky. "Hello, the camp," called a deep voice, respectfully keeping his distance. "I mean no harm." Catherine's finger trembled against the trigger. "Stay where you are," she called back, her voice stronger than she felt. The rider stopped his horse and slowly raised his hands. "Madam, I can see your fire's gone out. It's mighty cold for a lady and child to be without warmth tonight." In the dim light of the moon, Catherine could make out a broad-shouldered man with a dark hat pulled low over his eyes. A cowboy, by the look of him, with a worn leather vest and chaps. "My name's Matthew Tucker," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the still night air. "I work for the Diamond Bar Ranch about 15 miles east. I was tracking some strays when I spotted what was left of your fire." James stirred against Catherine, his small face pinched with cold even in sleep. "I've got supplies," Matthew continued. "Would appreciate your permission to light that fire again and maybe brew some coffee." After a pause, he added, "You can keep that pistol pointed my way if it makes you feel safer, madam." Catherine swallowed hard. The night was bitter and James needed warmth. "You can approach slowly," she said, keeping the revolver steady, "but I'll thank you to keep your distance once the fire's lit." Matthew dismounted with deliberate movements, leading his horse closer. In the moonlight, Catherine could see his face more clearly now, weathered from sun and wind, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble. Kind eyes that crinkled slightly at the corners met hers without challenge or threat. "That's your boy?" he asked softly, nodding toward James. "My son," Catherine confirmed, not volunteering more. Matthew nodded, then knelt to examine the dead fire. "Still got some good wood here," he observed. From his saddlebag, he withdrew a small tin of tinder and matches. With practiced efficiency, he coaxed a small flame to life, adding kindling and then larger pieces of wood that he gathered from nearby. Soon, a cheerful fire crackled where the dead ashes had been. The sudden warmth made Catherine realize just how cold she'd become. James shifted in his sleep, unconsciously moving closer to the heat. "Coffee," Matthew offered, holding up a battered pot. Catherine hesitated, then nodded. She hadn't had coffee in days, and the prospect of something hot was too tempting to refuse. As Matthew prepared the coffee, Catherine studied him. His movements were efficient, practiced a man accustomed to fending for himself in the wilderness. Yet there was a gentleness in how he kept his voice low to avoid waking James, in how he maintained a respectful distance as promised. "What brings a lady and her son out here alone, if you don't mind my asking?" he finally said, pouring steaming coffee into a tin cup and setting it on a rock within her reach. Catherine picked up the cup, grateful for the warmth against her palms. The stagecoach to Silverpine was attacked. "Bandits," she took a sip, the bitter liquid reviving her. "The driver was killed. They took the horses, left us stranded." Matthew's expression darkened. "The McClintock gang, most likely. They've been hitting stages between Laramie and Silverpine for months now." He shook his head. "You've been walking since then?" 2 days, Catherine confirmed. I thought we could make it to town, but… She glanced down at James, his face now peaceful in the firelight. I underestimated the distance. Silverpine's another 20 miles west, Matthew said gently. Rough country between here and there. Catherine felt tears threatening. 20 more miles, they would never have made it. You headed there for a reason, Matthew asked. I've been hired to teach at the new school. Pride made her straighten her shoulders. I have references from Pennsylvania. Matthew nodded thoughtfully, pouring himself a cup of coffee. School's almost finished. Town's been waiting on a teacher since last fall. The fire popped and crackled, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. James mumbled something in his sleep and snuggled closer to Catherine. She stroked his hair, a deep weariness settling into her bones now that warmth and the relative safety of Matthew's presence had eased her vigilance. You should sleep, madam, Matthew said, reading her exhaustion. I'll keep the fire going and stand watch till morning. Catherine tightened her grip on the revolver. Why would you do that for strangers? Matthew's gaze was steady. My ma taught me better than to leave a woman and child alone in the wild. A small smile touched his lips. Besides, I reckon Silverpine needs that teacher something fierce. Despite her wariness, Catherine found herself believing him. Still, she kept the revolver close. Thank you, Mr. Tucker. Matthew's fine, he replied, adding more wood to the fire. Get some rest, I'll be right here. Catherine settled back against the boulder, adjusting her position to keep both James and the fire within easy reach. The warmth and the gentle crackling of the flames soon lulled her toward sleep. The last thing she saw before her eyes closed was Matthew Tucker. Hat pushed back on his head, sitting on the other side of the fire, his rifle across his knees as he scanned the darkness beyond their small circle of light. When Catherine woke, dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon. James was still asleep beside her, wrapped in what she recognized as Matthew's coat. The fire burned steadily, and Matthew sat in the same position as the night before, though she noticed the collection of coffee cups and the fresh pot heating on the rocks. Morning, he said quietly. Sleep all right, Catherine nodded, embarrassed that she had slept so deeply while a stranger guarded them. Thank you for watching over us. Least I could do, Matthew replied, pouring her a fresh cup of coffee. Your boy slept through the night, must be exhausted. Catherine accepted the cup gratefully. James is resilient, too resilient for his age sometimes. As if hearing his name, James stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He stiffened immediately at the sight of the stranger, pressing closer to Catherine. It's all right, she assured him. This is Mr. Tucker. He helped us with the fire last night. James regarded Matthew warily. At 6, he had already learned that strangers could be dangerous, especially out here in the West. Morning, young man, Matthew said, his tone respectful rather than condescending. Your ma says your name is James. That's a fine name. James nodded solemnly. Are you a real cowboy? He asked after a moment of consideration. Matthew smiled. Yes, sir. Been working cattle since I was not much older than you. This seemed to satisfy James, who relaxed slightly. I'm hungry, Mama, he whispered to Catherine. Before Catherine could respond with the usual reassurances, Matthew reached into his saddlebag. I've got some jerky and hardtack, he offered. Not the finest breakfast, but it'll keep body and soul together till we reach the ranch. Catherine stiffened. The ranch? Matthew looked up from where he was unpacking his provisions. Diamond Bar's closest, about half a day's ride. The owner's a good man, Mrs. Donovan runs the kitchen, and there's plenty of space. He laid out strips of jerky and thick pieces of hardtack on a clean bandana. From there, I can arrange to get you safely to Silverpine. We can't impose, Catherine began, even as James eyed the food hungrily. Madam Catherine, Matthew said, using her name for the first time. It's no imposition. You'd never make it to Silverpine on foot, not with the boy. The ranch is the safest place for now. Catherine wanted to argue, to insist on their independence, but she knew he was right. They were lost, without provisions, and James needed proper food and shelter. Her pride wasn't worth risking her son's life. Very well, she conceded. We accept your help with gratitude. Matthew nodded, satisfied. Good, eat up and we'll head out. My horse can carry you both. After breakfast, which James devoured ravenously, Matthew helped them pack the few belongings they had salvaged from the stagecoach robbery. He extinguished the fire carefully, ensuring no embers remained to spark a wildfire. "Up you go," he said to James, lifting the boy effortlessly onto the saddle of his chestnut gelding. "You hold onto the horn there, just like a real cowboy." James beamed, his earlier wariness forgotten in the excitement of riding a real cowboy's horse. Matthew turned to Catherine, offering his interlaced fingers as a step. "I can walk," she protested weakly. 10 miles in those shoes." Matthew raised an eyebrow, glancing at her worn town boots. "Respectfully, madam, you'd be crawling by noon." Catherine couldn't argue with that. With as much dignity as she could muster, she placed her foot in his hands and allowed him to boost her up behind James. Matthew's strength was evident in how easily he lifted her, and for a moment their eyes met. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of the trust she was placing in him. Matthew took the reins and began leading the horse eastward, setting a steady pace that wouldn't tire the animal with its double burden. Catherine held James securely in front of her, watching Matthew's broad shoulders as he walked ahead, occasionally pointing out landmarks or wildlife to James, who absorbed everything with wide-eyed fascination. "Have you lived out here long?" Catherine asked after they had traveled for an hour or so. Matthew glanced back. "Coming up on 10 years, came west after the war like a lot of men. You fought." Catherine couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. He seemed young, perhaps only a few years older than her 24 years. "Union cavalry," Matthew confirmed. "Enlisted at 17, lied about my age, spent most of the war riding through Tennessee and Georgia." His voice grew quieter. "Saw things no boy should see." Catherine thought of Thomas, who'd never returned from Gettysburg. "My husband as well," she said softly, "though he didn't come back." Matthew was silent for a moment. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "The war took too many good men." They continued in companionable silence after that, the Wyoming landscape stretching vast and beautiful around them. Despite the circumstances, Catherine found herself admiring the rugged mountains in the distance, the sweeping plains dotted with sagebrush, and the clear blue sky that seemed to go on forever. Around midday, they stopped to rest beside a small creek. Matthew helped Catherine and James down from the horse, then led the animal to drink while Catherine stretched her sore muscles. "We're making good time," Matthew told them, returning with a refilled canteen. "Should reach the Diamond Bar by late afternoon." James had discovered a collection of pebbles by the creek and was arranging them in patterns on a flat rock. Catherine watched him fondly, grateful for children's ability to find joy in simple things even amid hardship. "He's a good boy," Matthew observed, following her gaze. "Smart, too, from the looks of it," Catherine nodded. "He takes after his father that way. Thomas was a schoolteacher before the war," she smiled sadly. "I was his student once, that's how we met. And now you're carrying on his work," Matthew said. The observation touched Catherine unexpectedly. "I suppose I am. I hadn't thought of it that way." They rested for half an hour before continuing their journey. This time, when Matthew helped Catherine onto the horse, his hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary. She told herself it was merely to ensure she was secure in the saddle, but the warmth of his touch stayed with her as they resumed their travels. The afternoon sun beat down on them as they crossed the rolling prairie. James dozed against Catherine, exhausted despite his position on horseback. Matthew walked steadily, seemingly tireless, occasionally humming fragments of songs Catherine didn't recognize. "What will you do in Silver Pine?" he asked during one of their brief rest stops. "Besides teaching, I mean." Catherine adjusted James's hat to better shade his face. "Build a life for us, find a small house to rent, make sure James has opportunities I didn't have." She looked out across the vast landscape. "I want him to grow up somewhere with room to breathe, where people judge a person by their character rather than their family name or background." "Is that how it was back east for you?" Catherine thought of the whispers that had followed her when she'd married Thomas, the disapproval from his family at his choice of a shopkeeper's daughter. "Sometimes." Pennsylvania isn't the most rigid place, but there are still expectations about who belongs where. Matthew nodded thoughtfully. The West has its own judgments, but they tend to be more about what you can do than who your daddy was. He smiled slightly. A smart woman who can teach might just find herself the most respected person in town, next to the preacher and the sheriff. The idea was novel to Catherine. Respect based on her abilities rather than her circumstances or connections. It was exactly what she'd hoped for when she'd decided to accept the teaching position. By late afternoon, as Matthew had predicted, the Diamond Bar Ranch came into view. The main house was larger than Catherine had expected, a two-story structure built of solid logs with a wide porch wrapping around three sides. Several outbuildings and corrals spread out around it, and in the distance, Catherine could see cattle grazing on the rolling grassland. "Home sweet home," Matthew said, "at least for now." As they approached, a tall man with iron-gray hair emerged onto the porch, shading his eyes against the setting sun. "That you, Tucker?" he called. "Yes, sir, Mr. Donovan," Matthew called back. "Got some folks who need our help." Catherine straightened her spine and adjusted her disheveled hair as best she could. First impressions mattered, especially when arriving as an unexpected guest. Patrick Donovan, the ranch owner, proved to be a gruff but kind-hearted man who welcomed Catherine and James without question once Matthew explained their situation. His wife, Eleanor, a plump, energetic woman with laugh lines around her eyes, immediately took charge. "Poor dears, you look half-starved and dead on your feet," she clucked, ushering Catherine and James into the house. "Matthew, Tucker, you get on and see to your horse while I get these two settled." Matthew tipped his hat to Catherine. "Yes, madam, I'll be along shortly." The interior of the ranch house was surprisingly refined, with polished wooden floors, comfortable furniture, and curtains at the windows. Eleanor led them upstairs to a small but clean bedroom with a view of the mountains. "This was our daughter's room," she explained, turning down the quilt on the bed. "She's married and living in Denver now. You and your boy can stay here as long as needed." Catherine was overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers. "Thank you, Mrs. Donovan. We won't impose for long. I need to reach Silverpine as soon as possible to claim my teaching position." Eleanor patted her hand. "All in good time, dear. First, you both need rest and proper meals. The school in Silverpine isn't going anywhere." After showing them where to find fresh water and towels, Eleanor left them to wash up before dinner. Catherine helped James clean his face and hands, then did her best to make herself presentable with the limited resources available. When they descended to the dining room, they found a substantial meal laid out: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from Eleanor's winter stores. Matthew was already seated at the table, freshly washed and wearing a clean shirt. He stood when Catherine entered, pulling out a chair for her with old-fashioned courtesy. "Thank you," she murmured, noticing that his hair, free of trail dust, was a rich brown that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. Dinner conversation was lively, with Patrick sharing news of the territory and Eleanor asking gentle questions about Catherine's journey west. Matthew remained relatively quiet, though Catherine often felt his gaze on her when she wasn't looking his way. James, revived by food and rest, charmed the Donovans with his curious questions about ranch life. By the meal's end, Patrick had promised to show him the new calves in the morning, "if that's all right with your mother, of course," he added, glancing at Catherine. "Of course," Catherine agreed, touched by how quickly these people had taken to her son. After dinner, while Eleanor showed James a collection of carved wooden animals that had belonged to her own children, Catherine stepped out onto the porch for a moment of solitude. The night was clear, with a canopy of stars overhead unlike anything she'd ever seen in Pennsylvania. She heard the door open behind her and knew, without turning, that it was Matthew. He came to stand beside her at the porch railing, keeping a respectful distance. "Thank you," Catherine said softly. "For everything, if you hadn't found us." "But I did," Matthew replied simply. "No need to dwell on what didn't happen." They stood in companionable silence, watching the stars. Catherine was acutely aware of his presence, the clean scent of soap, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way he occasionally shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "How long have you worked for the Donovans?" she finally asked. "Going on 7 years," Matthew answered. "Came here after trying my hand at prospecting. Turned out I'm better with cattle than gold pans." He chuckled softly. "Patrick's a good man to work for, treats his hands fair, runs an honest operation." "And your family, are they in Wyoming too?" Matthew's expression sobered. "Lost my parents to typhoid when I was 14. No siblings. Closest thing to family I've got is right here on the Diamond Bar." Catherine's heart ached for the lonely boy he must have been. "I'm sorry," Matthew shrugged. "It was a long time ago. What about you? Any family besides James?" "My parents are still in Pennsylvania. My father runs a small general store." Catherine smiled at the memory of her childhood home. "We write, but they're getting older. The journey west was too much for them to consider." "Must have taken courage, coming all this way on your own with a child," Matthew observed. Catherine hadn't thought of it as courage, necessity, perhaps, hope for a better future. "It was the only way forward I could see," she admitted. "After Thomas died, opportunities for a widow with a child were limited." Matthew nodded, understanding. "The West needs good teachers. Silverpine's lucky to have you." From inside, they heard James's laughter, followed by Aliner's warm chuckle. The sound warmed Catherine's heart. It had been too long since she'd heard her son laugh so freely. "He's taking to ranch life already," Matthew remarked. "Boys his age are adaptable," Catherine said. "Too adaptable sometimes. I worry that he doesn't remember his father as clearly as he should." "How old was he when his father died?" "2," Catherine replied. "Thomas went to war when James was just beginning to walk. He came home on leave once when James was almost a year old. Then Gettysburg happened." Matthew's expression was sympathetic but not pitying. Catherine appreciated that. She'd had her fill of pitying looks back in Pennsylvania. "Memory's a funny thing," he said after a moment. "I don't remember my father's face anymore, not clearly, but I remember how it felt when he taught me to ride, the sound of his laugh, the way he smelled of tobacco and leather." He glanced at her. "Your boy might not recall his father's features, but I'd wager he knows the important things in his heart." Catherine blinked back unexpected tears. "Thank you for saying that." The porch door opened, and Aliner appeared with a sleepy James at her side. "I believe this young cowboy is ready for bed," she announced. "He's had quite a day." Catherine nodded, grateful for the interruption that allowed her to compose herself. "Yes, it's well past his bedtime. Thank you, Mrs. Donovan, for entertaining him." "Aliner, please," the older woman insisted. "And it was my pleasure. It's been too long since we've had a child's laughter in this house." Catherine took James's hand. "Say good night, James." "Good night, Mr. Tucker," James said, stifling a yawn. "Will you show me how to rope tomorrow?" Matthew smiled. "If your mother says it's all right, I'll show you a few tricks after my morning chores." James looked up at Catherine with pleading eyes. "Can I, Mama, please?" "We'll see," Catherine hedged, not wanting to make promises about tomorrow when their situation remained uncertain. "For now, it's bedtime." She led James back inside, feeling Matthew's gaze follow them. As she tucked her son into the unfamiliar bed a few minutes later, she found her thoughts returning to the cowboy who had quite literally saved their lives. His quiet strength, his kindness toward James, the way he looked at her as though truly seeing her, all of it stirred feelings she had thought long buried with Thomas. "I like Mr. Tucker," James murmured sleepily as she pulled the quilt to his chin. "He's nice, and he's a real cowboy." Catherine smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "Yes, he is very nice. We're lucky he found us." "Can we stay here?" James asked, his eyes already closing. "Just for a little while," Catherine replied. "We need to go to Silverpine soon, remember, for my teaching job." But James was already asleep, his breathing deep and even. Catherine pressed a kiss to his forehead, then prepared for bed herself, grateful for clean sheets and a roof overhead after their ordeal in the wilderness. In the days that followed, Catherine and James settled into life at the Diamond Bar. True to his word, Matthew began teaching James the basics of ranch life, how to feed the chickens, collect eggs, and even simple rope tricks with a small lariat Patrick had found in the attic. James thrived under the attention, following Matthew around like a devoted shadow whenever Catherine allowed it. For her part, Catherine found ways to make herself useful around the ranch. She helped Alina with cooking and mending, organized the small collection of books in Patrick's study, and even offered to teach the youngest ranch hand, a 16-year-old named Billy, his letters and numbers during the evening hours. "You're a natural teacher," Alina observed one afternoon as they worked together in the kitchen, preparing supper. "The way you explained fractions to Billy last night using that apple pie, I've never seen that boy so interested in learning." Catherine smiled as she rolled out dough for biscuits. "Teaching is about finding what interests the student and building from there. Billy wants to keep his own accounts someday instead of trusting storekeepers to do it right. That's his motivation." Alina nodded approvingly. "Silverpine's children will be fortunate to have you." The mention of Silverpine brought a conflicted feeling to Catherine's heart. She knew they needed to continue their journey soon. The school term was due to begin in just over 2 weeks, yet she found herself reluctant to leave the safety and comfort of the Diamond Bar. And if she was honest with herself, she was even more reluctant to leave Matthew Tucker. Over the past 5 days, she had come to know him better through their conversations on the porch each evening after James was asleep. Matthew had told her about his time in the war, his brief, unsuccessful attempt at prospecting for gold, and his eventual discovery that working with cattle brought him a satisfaction he'd never found elsewhere. In turn, Catherine had shared stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, her courtship with Thomas, and her dreams for James's future. Matthew listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights that sometimes surprised her with their perception. "You're very different from most men I've known," she told him on the 4th night, as they sat watching a spring thunderstorm roll across the distant plains. "How so?" he asked, curious rather than defensive. Catherine considered her words carefully. "You really listen when I speak. And you seem to respect my opinions even when they differ from your own." Matthew looked surprised. "Shouldn't every man do that?" "They should," Catherine agreed, "but in my experience, few do." "Then you've known the wrong sort of men," Matthew said simply. "Except your husband, I expect." Catherine smiled at the memory of Thomas. "Yes, Thomas was like that too. It's one of the reasons I loved him." She hadn't meant to use that particular word love and felt heat rise to her cheeks as soon as it escaped her lips. Matthew didn't comment on it, but something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes that made Catherine's heart beat faster. Now, as she worked beside Alina in the kitchen, Catherine wondered what would happen when they left for Silverpine. Would Matthew escort them there and then return to his life at the Diamond Bar? Would their paths ever cross again in the vastness of Wyoming territory? "You're wool-gathering, dear," Alina's voice broke into her thoughts. "That dough's thin enough now." Catherine started, realizing she'd been rolling the same piece of dough far longer than necessary. "I'm sorry, my mind wandered." Alina gave her a knowing look. "To our young cowboy, perhaps." Catherine busied herself with cutting the dough into biscuits. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course you don't," Alina said dryly. "And Matthew doesn't watch the door like a hawk every time you leave a room either." Catherine's hands stilled. "Does he?" Alina chuckled. "Like I said, wool-gathering." She patted Catherine's arm. "It's all right to feel something, you know. You're young and life is for living." Before Catherine could respond, the back door opened, and Matthew himself entered, carrying a basket of vegetables from the kitchen garden. His eyes found Catherine immediately, just as Alina had suggested, and a smile spread across his face. "Ladies," he greeted them, setting the basket on the table. "Mrs. Donovan, I got those carrots and potatoes you wanted, and I found the first spring onions coming up in the south corner." "Wonderful," Alina exclaimed, examining his harvest. "These will be perfect for the stew." Matthew lingered, his eyes straying to Catherine again. "James is helping Patrick mend a section of fence near the barn," he told her. "Boy's got a knack for it, watches everything, remembers it all." Catherine felt a surge of maternal pride. He's always been observant. Even as a baby, he would watch everything so intently. "Patrick says he'd make a fine rancher someday," Matthew continued. his tone casual but his eyes watchful. The implication that James might have a future here in Wyoming rather than back east hung in the air between them. Catherine found herself both attracted to and frightened by the idea. A life here would be so different from anything she had known, but wasn't that why she had come west in the first place? For a new beginning, we should finish these biscuits, Alina announced, breaking the moment. Matthew, would you mind bringing in some more firewood before supper? Yes, madam, Matthew agreed, giving Catherine one last lingering look before heading back outside. Alina waited until the door closed behind him. That boy's sweet on you, Catherine, has been since he brought you here. Catherine felt her face warm. He's kind to everyone, Alina hummed skeptically. That's why he volunteers for every errand that might put him in your path and why he sits on the porch with you till all hours. She shook her head. I've known Matthew Tucker for 7 years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Catherine busied herself arranging biscuits on a baking sheet. Even if that were true, and I'm not saying it as I have responsibilities, a position waiting in Silver Pine. James's future to consider. All true, Alina conceded, but Silver Pine is only a day's ride from here, and from what Patrick tells me they're desperate for a teacher. They'd wait a few more weeks if necessary. The suggestion hung in the air, tempting in its simplicity. A few more weeks at the Diamond Bar, time to sort through her confused feelings. Time for James to enjoy this unexpected interlude of happiness. I'll think about it, Catherine finally said, not meeting Alina's knowing gaze. Later that evening, after supper had been cleared away and James was upstairs with a picture book Patrick had found for him, Catherine slipped out to the porch. The night was cool but pleasant, with a half moon casting silver light across the ranch yard. She wasn't surprised when the door opened behind her a few minutes later. Matthew joined her at the railing, keeping the same respectful distance he always maintained. James was telling me about the constellations at supper, he said you taught him to find the North Star and the Big Dipper. Catherine smiled, looking up at the familiar patterns of stars. Thomas started teaching him when he was just a baby. He used to hold him up to the window at night and name the stars. After he died, I continued the tradition. Your husband sounds like he was a good father, Matthew said softly. He was, Catherine agreed, or he would have been if he'd had the chance. She turned to look at Matthew directly. Alina says the school in Silver Pine might be willing to wait a few more weeks for me to arrive. Matthew's expression remained carefully neutral. Do you want to stay longer? James is happy here, Catherine said, not quite answering the question. Happier than I've seen him in a long time. And you, Matthew asked, his voice low, are you happy here, Catherine? The sound of her name on his lips sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cool night air. I don't know what I am, she admitted. Confused, mostly. Matthew took a step closer, still not touching her but near enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. About what? Catherine took a shaky breath. About what I want, what's best for James, what I feel when. She faltered, unable to finish the thought. When, Matthew prompted gently. Catherine gathered her courage. When you look at me the way you're looking at me right now. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken feelings. Matthew's eyes, dark in the moonlight, held her steadily. I've been trying not to, he confessed. You've been through so much and you have plans, a future mapped out. The last thing you need is. He trailed off. Is what? Catherine asked, barely above a whisper. A cowboy with nothing to offer but a good horse and 10 years' worth of savings, Matthew finished, a hint of bitterness in his tone. Catherine surprised herself by reaching out to touch his arm. That's not how I see you. Matthew looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then back to her face. How do you see me, Catherine? The question hung between them, demanding honesty she wasn't sure she was ready to give. Before she could formulate an answer, a cry came from inside the house. Mama. Catherine withdrew her hand immediately, recognizing the sound of James having one of his nightmares. I need to go to him. Matthew nodded, stepping back. Of course. Catherine hurried inside and up the stairs to find James sitting up in bed, tears streaming down his face. The bad men came back, he sobbed as she gathered him into her arms, the ones who took the horses and shot the driver. SHH, Catherine soothed, rocking him gently. It was just a dream. You're safe here. I've got you. I don't want to go away, James hiccuped against her shoulder. I like it here with Mr. Donovan and Mrs. Donovan and Mr. Tucker. Catherine's heart ached at his words. We have to go to Silverpine eventually, sweetheart. That's where my job is. Can't you teach here? James asked, pulling back to look at her with tear-stained cheeks. Mr. Billy needs learning, and maybe other people too. Catherine wiped away his tears with her thumb. It's not that simple, James. Why not? Came a deep voice from the doorway. Catherine looked up to find Matthew standing there, a concerned expression on his face. I heard him cry out, he explained. Wanted to make sure everything was all right. James reached out a hand toward Matthew. Tell Mama we can stay, Mr. Tucker, please. Matthew entered the room hesitantly, coming to stand beside the bed. He took James's small hand in his large one. That's your Mama's decision, partner. But I want you to know that whatever she decides, you're always welcome at the Diamond Bar, both of you. James seemed comforted by this assurance and eventually settled back to sleep, clutching the wooden horse Patrick had given him. When Catherine was certain he was deeply asleep, she followed Matthew into the hallway, closing the bedroom door softly behind her. I'm sorry about that, she whispered. He's had nightmares since the stagecoach attack. No need to apologize, Matthew assured her. He's been through a lot. Truth is, I still have dreams about the war sometimes. Time helps, but some things just stay with you. Catherine nodded, understanding all too well. She had her own recurring nightmares receiving the telegram about Thomas, standing at his empty grave, facing a future alone with an infant son. What James said, Matthew began tentatively, about you teaching here instead of Silverpine, Catherine sighed. It was just a child's wish. He doesn't understand obligations and contracts. Maybe not, Matthew agreed, but there's some sense in it too, the Diamond Bar's growing. Patrick's been talking about hiring more hands, maybe even bringing in some families to help work the place. There'd be children needing schooling. Catherine stared at him, surprised by the suggestion. Are you serious? Matthew nodded. Patrick mentioned it at dinner yesterday while you were helping James with his food. Said he's been thinking about turning the old bunkhouse into a proper schoolhouse, bringing in a teacher a couple of days a week. The idea was tempting, impossibly so, but my position in Silverpine might still be there after you fulfill a term here, Matthew finished for her. Or might not, that's the risk. Catherine leaned against the wall, suddenly overwhelmed. I don't know what to do, she admitted. Coming west was supposed to be a fresh start, but everything's happened so differently than I planned. Matthew moved closer, his voice low and earnest. Sometimes the best things in life are the ones we don't plan for. Their eyes met in the dim hallway, and Catherine felt as though something invisible but powerful passed between them. Without conscious thought, she found herself leaning toward him, drawn by a force as inevitable as gravity. Matthew's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as a whisper. Catherine, he breathed, her name a question and an answer all at once. The moment stretched, taut with possibility, until the sound of a door opening down the hall broke the spell. They stepped apart as Patrick emerged from the master bedroom, headed toward the stairs. Everything all right? The rancher asked, noting their position in the hallway. James had a nightmare, Catherine explained quickly. He's settled now. Patrick nodded, accepting the explanation. Good. Night then, he said, continuing toward the stairs. When his footsteps had faded, Catherine looked back at Matthew, her heart still racing. I should get some sleep, she said, though sleep was the furthest thing from her mind. Matthew nodded, respecting her retreat. We can talk more tomorrow about everything. Tomorrow, Catherine agreed, slipping back into James's room before she could change her mind. Sleep was elusive that night as Catherine's thoughts churned with possibilities and fears. By morning, she had made no decisions, but felt at least that she understood her own heart better. Whatever happened next, she could no longer deny her growing feelings for Matthew Tucker. Breakfast was a lively affair, with James chattering about the day's anticipated adventures and Patrick discussing plans for spring calving. Catherine was quieter than usual, aware of Matthew's presence across the table but avoiding direct eye contact. As the meal ended, Patrick cleared his throat. "Matthew, I need you to ride to Silverpine today. Telegram came yesterday about those new breeding bulls. Need you to arrange delivery and see about ordering more fencing supplies." Catherine's head snapped up, her eyes finally meeting Matthew's. Silverpine, the very place she was meant to go. "Yes, sir," Matthew replied, his gaze still locked with Catherine's. "I can head out within the hour." "Good man," Patrick approved, pushing back from the table. "Oh, and while you're there, might as well stop by the school board. Ask about their plans for the term." Catherine frowned, confused. "The school board," Patrick's expression was carefully innocent. "Just curious about their teaching arrangements. Professional interest, you might say." Eleanor shot her husband a warning look. "Patrick, what?" he asked defensively. "Can't a man take an interest in education?" The exchange confirmed Catherine's suspicion that the Donovans had been discussing her situation, perhaps even making plans that involved her. Under normal circumstances, she might have felt offended by such presumption. Instead, she felt a strange sense of relief that others were thinking about possibilities she herself had been afraid to consider. After breakfast, as Matthew prepared for his journey, Catherine found him in the barn, saddling his horse. She hesitated in the doorway, watching him work with practiced efficiency. "Taking an interest in saddle cinches?" he asked without turning, somehow aware of her presence. Catherine smiled despite her nerves. "I thought we might talk before you left, about yesterday." Matthew tightened the last strap before turning to face her. In the soft light filtering through the barn's high windows, his features seemed more defined, more dear to her than she had realized. "Yesterday," he echoed. "Which part?" Catherine stepped further into the barn, away from potential observers at the house. "The part where we almost—" She couldn't quite bring herself to say it. "Kissed," Matthew finished for her, direct as always. "Yes, I remember that part quite clearly." Catherine twisted her hands together. "I'm not sure what I'm doing, Matthew. It's been 3 years since Thomas died, but sometimes it feels like yesterday, and other times—" She looked up at him. "Other times it feels like another lifetime." Matthew moved closer, stopping just short of touching her. "I would never try to replace your husband, Catherine. No man could or should. But that doesn't mean there isn't room in your heart for something new, something different." His words echoed her own thoughts so closely that Catherine felt a flash of connection so profound it almost took her breath away. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Of what? Of making the wrong decision for James, for myself." She gestured helplessly. "Everything happened so fast. Meeting you, coming here, I need time to think clearly." Matthew nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Then take the time. I'm not going anywhere well except to Silverpine today," he amended with a small smile. "But I'll be back tonight." Catherine found herself returning his smile. "Will you? Would you be willing to inquire about my position, see if they'd consider delaying my start date, just until I'm certain what's best?" "I'll ask," Matthew promised. "And Catherine, whatever you decide, I'll respect it." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. "Thank you." On impulse, she reached up and pressed a quick kiss to his cheek before turning and hurrying back to the house, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The day passed slowly for Catherine, filled with domestic tasks that couldn't quite distract her from thoughts of Matthew's journey and what news he might bring back from Silverpine. James spent the morning with Patrick, inspecting fences, as the rancher called it, and returned for lunch full of stories about cows and horses and the proper way to mend barbed wire. "Mr. Donovan says I'm a natural ranch hand," he announced proudly as he devoured the sandwich Eleanor had prepared for him. "Said I could have a job here when I grow up if I want." Catherine exchanged glances with Eleanor, who merely raised her eyebrows as if to say, "See what I mean." "That's a kind offer," Catherine replied carefully, "but you have many years of growing and learning ahead before you need to decide on such things." James nodded seriously. "I know, first I need lots of schooling." "Mr. Donovan says the smartest ranchers are the ones who know their numbers and can read good books about cattle and horses." Catherine smiled, relieved that Patrick had emphasized education even while encouraging James's interest in ranch life. Mr. Donovan is a wise man. Are we staying here, Mama? James asked suddenly, his young face earnest. Instead of going to the other place, Catherine hesitated, caught off guard by the direct question. I'm considering it, she admitted, not wanting to give him false hope but unable to lie about her uncertainty. James's face lit up. Really, we could stay with Mr. Tucker and the Donovans. It's not that simple, sweetheart, Catherine cautioned. There are many things to consider, my job in Silverpine for one. But Mr. Donovan said he needs a teacher here too, James persisted. He told me so this morning. Catherine shot a surprised look at Alina, who shrugged. My husband works quickly when he gets an idea in his head, she explained. Especially when it involves people he's grown fond of. I see, Catherine murmured, not sure whether to be touched or alarmed by how rapidly events seemed to be moving. After lunch, while James napped a habit he'd nearly outgrown but had resumed since their ordeal in the wilderness, Catherine sought out Patrick in his study. The rancher looked up from his ledgers as she knocked on the open door. Catherine, he greeted her warmly. Come in. What can I do for you? Catherine entered, closing the door behind her. James tells me you've been discussing the possibility of a school here at the Diamond Bar, she said, getting straight to the point. Patrick had the grace to look slightly abashed. Ah, yes, I might have mentioned it to the boy. Hope that's all right. It would have been better to discuss it with me first, Catherine said, trying to keep her tone even. James is very excited about the idea now. Patrick nodded, accepting the gentle rebuke. You're right, of course. I apologize for getting ahead of myself. He gestured to a chair across from his desk. But since we're talking about it now, would you like to hear what I have in mind? Catherine sat down, her curiosity overcoming her irritation. Yes, I would. Patrick leaned forward, his enthusiasm evident, the Diamond Bars growing. We've got 15 hands now, up from just 6 when I started 10 years ago. 3 of them have families that live in cabins on the property, with 5 children between them. Billy makes 6, counting him as a student rather than a hand. 6 children isn't exactly a school, Catherine pointed out. Not yet, Patrick agreed, but the neighboring ranches have families too. The Hamilton place has 3 children, the Circle M has 4. All told, there's about 15 children within riding distance who have no proper schooling. Catherine was surprised by the number. And these families would send their children here, in a heartbeat, Patrick assured her. Most of them are trying to teach their young uns at home, but ranching doesn't leave much time for lessons. They've been talking about pooling resources to hire a teacher for years, but no one suitable has come along. Until now, Catherine said, beginning to understand. Patrick nodded. Until now, when Matthew brought you here and we saw how you worked with Billy, Alina, and I got to thinking. You're exactly what this area needs. The idea was becoming more appealing the more Catherine considered it. A small school with students from ranching families, a community that valued education enough to create an opportunity where none had existed before. What about the practical details? She asked. A schoolhouse supplies my living arrangements. Patrick smiled, clearly pleased that she was considering the proposal seriously. The old bunkhouse can be converted easily enough. It's solid built with good windows. As for supplies, I've been setting aside funds for community improvements for years. Books, slates, whatever you need. And where would James and I live? Here, if you like, Patrick offered immediately. We've plenty of room, and Alina would be delighted to have you stay on. Or if you prefer your own place, there's a small cabin near the creek that was built for the foreman before he married and moved into town. It would need some fixing up, but it could be made comfortable. Catherine was almost overwhelmed by the generosity of the offer. Why would you do all this? You barely know me. Patrick's expression grew thoughtful. I've lived out here 30 years, Catherine, seen all kinds of people come and go, got a pretty good sense for character. He leaned back in his chair. You're the real article smart, hardworking, devoted to your boy. The kind of person who makes a community stronger just by being part of it. His words touched Catherine deeply. Thank you, that means a great deal. Besides, Patrick added with a twinkle in his eye, I've never seen Matthew Tucker look at anyone the way he looks at you. That boy's been like a son to us these past 7 years. His happiness matters to Alina and me. Catherine felt her cheeks warm. Matthew and I, it's very new, I'm not sure what will happen. Life's never sure, Patrick said sagely, but sometimes you have to make room for possibilities. Catherine nodded, his words resonating with her own thoughts. I'll consider your offer carefully, she promised, but I need to know what's happening with my position in Silverpine before I can make any decisions. Of course, Patrick agreed. Matthew should be back with news by supper time. As if summoned by the mention of his name, they heard the sound of hoofbeats in the yard. Catherine's heart jumped as she glanced out the window to see Matthew dismounting from his horse, his tall figure unmistakable even at a distance. Speak of the devil, Patrick chuckled, rising from his desk. Let's go see what he's learned. They found Matthew in the kitchen, accepting a cup of coffee from Alina while James peppered him with questions about his journey. Did you see the town? Are there lots of people? Did you bring me anything? The boy asked rapid fire, bouncing on his toes with excitement. Matthew laughed, ruffling James's hair. Yes, I saw the town. It's about twice the size of the Diamond Bar's main buildings. Yes, there are quite a few people. And yes, he reached into his saddlebag and produced a small, carved wooden whistle. I brought you something. James took the whistle with reverent hands. Thank you, Mr. Tucker. He immediately put it to his lips and blew a shrill note that made everyone wince. Perhaps outside would be a better place to practice your new skill, Catherine suggested, giving Matthew an exasperated but fond look. Sorry, Matthew said, not looking sorry at all as James raced outside to test his gift. Couldn't resist. The general store had them by the counter. Catherine shook her head, amused despite herself. Did you learn anything about the school position? She asked, unable to wait any longer. Matthew's expression grew more serious. I did. The school board was meeting when I arrived, 3 men representing the town council, the church, and the local businesses. He took a sip of coffee before continuing. I explained your situation, said you'd been delayed by the stagecoach robbery but were still interested in the position. And Catherine prompted when he paused. They were relieved to hear you're alive, Matthew said. News of the robbery had reached them, but no one knew what had happened to the passengers. They assumed the worst when you didn't arrive as scheduled. Catherine felt a pang of guilt at the worry she must have caused. What did they say about the position? They've hired someone else, Matthew said simply. A man from Denver arrived 3 days ago inquiring about work. When they explained they were waiting for a teacher who might not be coming, he offered his services. He was a schoolmaster back east before the war. Catherine sat down heavily in the nearest chair, the news hitting her with unexpected force. I see. I'm sorry, Catherine, Matthew said, his eyes full of genuine regret. I know you were counting on that position. Catherine was surprised to discover that her primary emotion wasn't disappointment but relief. The decision had been made for her, releasing her from the weight of choosing between Silverpine and the Diamond Bar. It's all right, she said slowly. Perhaps it's for the best. Alina and Patrick exchanged glances. Does this mean you'll consider our offer? Alina asked hopefully. Matthew looked confused. What offer? To establish a school here at the Diamond Bar, Patrick explained. For our Hands children and those from neighboring ranches, with Catherine as the teacher, of course. Matthew's expression transformed from confusion to delight. You're serious. A school here. We were just discussing it when you arrived, Catherine confirmed, watching his reaction carefully. That would be. Matthew seemed at a loss for words, which Catherine found endearing from a man usually so direct. Do you want to stay, Catherine? He finally asked, the question encompassing far more than the teaching position, 4 pairs of eyes fixed on her, waiting for her answer. In that moment, Catherine realized that she had already made her decision, perhaps days ago, without fully acknowledging it to herself. Yes, she said simply. I think I do. The relief and joy on Matthew's face made her heart swell. Alina clapped her hands together in delight, while Patrick nodded as though he'd never doubted the outcome. Wonderful, Alina exclaimed. Oh, we must celebrate. I'll make a special supper tonight. Patrick, fetch that bottle of wine you've been saving. As the Donovans bustled about making plans, Matthew moved to Catherine's side. Are you sure? He asked quietly. This isn't just because of the silver pine position falling through, Catherine shook her head. No, it's not that. Or not only that, she looked up at him, allowing herself to be honest about her feelings at last. It's because of James, because of the Donovans, because of you. Matthew's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with her own. I don't want to rush you, Catherine. I know you've been through a lot and you need time. I do, she agreed. But that doesn't mean I don't know what I want, what I feel. The look in Matthew's eyes was tender enough to make her breath catch. And what do you feel? He asked softly. Before Catherine could answer, James came running back into the kitchen, his new whistle clutched triumphantly in his hand. Mama, Mr. Donovan says we might stay here and you could be the teacher for a real school. Is it true? Catherine smiled at her son, her heart full of love for this resilient boy who had endured so much. Yes, sweetheart, it's true, if that's what you want too. James's face lit up with pure joy. More than anything, he threw his arms around her waist, hugging her tightly. Can Mr. Tucker stay too? Catherine met Matthew's eyes over her son's head. Mr. Tucker already lives here, James. He works for the Diamond Bar, remember? James looked up at her seriously. But I mean with us, like a family. The innocent question hung in the air, loaded with implications that James couldn't fully understand. Catherine felt her cheeks flush, but Matthew answered before she could formulate a response. That's something your mama and I need to talk about, he said gently, crouching down to James's level. Grown-up things take time, partner, but no matter what happens, I'll always be your friend, that's a promise. James considered this solemnly before nodding. Okay, but I hope you can be more than friends. Mama's happier when you're around, I can tell. With that devastating observation, he scampered back outside, leaving Catherine mortified and Matthew fighting a smile. From the mouths of babes, Alina murmured, barely concealing her own amusement as she bustled past with a basket of vegetables. I should go. Help Alina, Catherine said weakly, needing a moment to compose herself. Matthew caught her hand as she turned to leave. We'll talk later, he asked, his voice low and full of promise. Catherine nodded, her pulse quickening. Later. The celebratory dinner that evening was a joyful affair. Patrick opened a bottle of fine California wine he'd been saving for a special occasion, and Alina prepared a feast that included a roast chicken, fresh bread, and an apple pie that James declared was the best thing ever baked. Throughout the meal, Catherine found her gaze continually drawn to Matthew, who sat across from her. Each time their eyes met, a silent communication passed between them, full of promise and possibility. After James had been put to bed, full of excitement about their new plans and exhausted from the day's adventures, Catherine slipped out to the porch once more. The night was clear and cool, with a canopy of stars overhead and the silhouettes of distant mountains outlined against the horizon. She heard the door open behind her and knew without turning that Matthew had joined her. This time, when he came to stand beside her at the railing, he stood closer than before, his arm brushing against hers. Beautiful night, he observed, looking up at the stars. Yes, Catherine agreed. I never imagined the sky could hold so many stars until I came west. They stood in companionable silence for a few minutes, shoulder to shoulder, before Matthew spoke again. I've been thinking about what James said earlier, he began, about us being more than friends. Catherine turned to face him, her heart beating faster. Have you? Matthew nodded, his expression serious but his eyes warm in the soft light spilling from the house windows. I know it's soon. Too soon, maybe, but I want you to know that I've never felt this way about anyone before, Catherine. Not ever. The simple honesty of his declaration touched her deeply. I haven't either, she admitted. Not since Thomas. I didn't think I could again. Matthew's hand reached up to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. I'm not asking for promises, Catherine. Just a chance, time to see what might grow between us. Catherine leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. I'd like that very much, she whispered. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Matthew lowered his head until his lips met hers in a kiss so tender, it brought tears to her eyes. His hands cradled her face as though she were something infinitely precious, and Catherine felt something within her that had been frozen for 3 long years begin to thaw. When they finally parted, Matthew rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing a little faster than before. "I've been wanting to do that since the first night I found you by that dead fire," he confessed. Catherine smiled, remembering how he had appeared like an answer to an unspoken prayer, lighting a new fire and standing guard over her and James until dawn. "I'm glad you waited," she said softly. "It made it more special." Matthew tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering. "I'd wait forever for you, Catherine Reed, however long you need." The weeks that followed were filled with activity as plans for the Diamond Bar School took shape. Patrick and his ranch hands worked to convert the old bunkhouse into a proper schoolhouse, adding more windows for light and building simple desks and benches. Catherine wrote to her parents in Pennsylvania, explaining her change in circumstances and requesting that they ship the books and teaching materials she had left in their care. Word spread quickly to neighboring ranches, and soon Catherine found herself meeting with parents eager to enroll their children in the new school. Most were hard-working ranch families who valued education, but had few opportunities to provide it for their children in this remote corner of Wyoming. Through it all, Catherine's relationship with Matthew deepened. They spent every evening together after James was asleep, sometimes talking for hours about their pasts, their hopes for the future, and everything in between. Other times they simply sat together in comfortable silence, content in each other's company. James thrived in their new home, following Matthew around the ranch whenever he could and soaking up knowledge about cattle, horses, and the land like a sponge. The nightmares that had plagued him after the stagecoach attack grew less frequent, then ceased altogether as he settled into the security of life at the Diamond Bar. By the time Catherine's books and supplies arrived from Pennsylvania, along with a warm letter from her parents expressing their cautious approval of her new situation, the schoolhouse was ready. Classes began with 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 16, including James and Billy. Catherine discovered that teaching children from ranching families presented unique challenges and rewards. Her students brought practical knowledge and skills that city children lacked, but needed help with formal academic subjects. She adapted her lessons accordingly, incorporating the rhythms and realities of ranch life into her teaching. One evening in late May, as Catherine sat on the porch grading papers while James slept upstairs, Matthew joined her with an unusually serious expression. "Got something to show you," he said, holding out his hand. "If you're not too busy," Catherine set aside her work curiously. "Not too busy for you, what is it?" "It's a bit of a walk," Matthew warned, "but I think you'll find it worth the journey." Intrigued, Catherine placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her away from the house and along a path that wound through a stand of cottonwoods toward the creek. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the air was sweet with the scent of spring flowers. "Where are we going?" Catherine asked as they crossed the creek on stepping stones and continued up a gentle rise. "You'll see," Matthew replied mysteriously. They crested the hill and Catherine gasped. Below them, nestled in a small valley, stood a cabin, not the run-down structure Patrick had mentioned, but a solid, well-built home with a porch wrapping around two sides and smoke rising from the chimney. "Matthew," she breathed, "what is this?" Matthew's eyes were fixed on her face, gauging her reaction. "It's the foreman's cabin Patrick told you about. Some of the boys and I have been working on it in our spare time." Catherine turned to him in amazement. "This is what you've been doing when you disappeared after supper these past weeks." "Fixing up this cabin?" Matthew nodded, a hint of uncertainty in his expression. "Do you like it? If not, we can make changes. I wanted it to be a surprise, but nothing's final. It's beautiful," Catherine assured him, squeezing his hand. "But Matthew, why?" "The Donovans have made it clear we're welcome to stay in the main house as long as we want." Matthew took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "I thought you and James might want a place of your own someday. A home, not just rooms in someone else's house." The implication behind his words was clear, and Catherine felt her heart begin to race. "May I see inside?" she asked softly, Matthew's smile was answer enough as he led her down the hill to the cabin. Up close, she could see the careful craftsmanship that had gone into the restoration new glass in the windows, fresh chinking between the logs, a sturdy door with a polished brass handle. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area and two smaller rooms off to one side. A fire burned cheerfully in the stone fireplace, casting warm light over the rough-hewn furniture. "It's not fancy," Matthew said as Catherine explored the space, running her hands over the smooth wooden table, examining the shelves built into one wall. "But it's solid. The roof doesn't leak and the chimney draws well." "You did all this for us?" Catherine asked, her voice thick with emotion. Matthew moved to stand before her, taking both her hands in his. "Catherine Reed, I've loved you since the night I found you beside that dead fire," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I love your courage, your kindness, your dedication to James and your students. I love the way you see beauty in simple things, the way you listen when others speak, the way you've made a place for yourself here as though you were always meant to be part of the Diamond Bar." Catherine's eyes filled with tears as Matthew continued, his words washing over her like a benediction. "I know it hasn't been long, and I'll wait if you need more time. But I want to build a life with you and James. I want to be a father to him, a husband to you. I want to grow old watching you teach generations of children in that schoolhouse." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, which Catherine recognized with a start as a simple gold band with a small pearl set in the center. "This was my mother's," Matthew explained, his voice roughening with emotion. "The only thing of hers I kept all these years. I've been carrying it since the day after you agreed to stay at the Diamond Bar, waiting for the right moment." He took a deep breath. "Catherine Reed, will you marry me?" Catherine looked from the ring to Matthew's face, her vision blurred by tears. In that moment, all her doubts and fears seemed to fall away, leaving only the certainty that this man, this place, was where she and James belonged. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Matthew Tucker, I will marry you." Matthew's face lit with such joy that Catherine felt her heart might burst. He slid the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, then pulled her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the love and promise of their future together. Later, as they walked hand in hand back to the main house under a sky brilliant with stars, Catherine thought of how far she had come from that desperate night when she had huddled beside a dead fire with her sleeping child, certain they were alone in the vast wilderness. She thought of Thomas, who would always hold a place in her heart, and found comfort in knowing he would have approved of the man who would help raise his son. But mostly, she thought of the future of James growing strong and confident on the ranch, of children filling the schoolhouse with laughter and learning, of evenings on the porch with Matthew, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky. And she knew, with the deep certainty of a woman who had faced loss and found love again, that she was finally home. In the summer of 1873, Catherine Reed became Catherine Tucker in a simple ceremony performed by the circuit preacher at the Diamond Bar Ranch. James stood proudly beside them, holding the rings and beaming at the man who had promised to be his father in all the ways that mattered. The schoolhouse became a center of community life, with families gathering for socials and celebrations as well as learning. Catherine's reputation as a dedicated teacher spread throughout the territory, and enrollment grew steadily as more families moved to the area. Matthew continued working as Patrick Donovan's foreman, eventually purchasing a partnership in the Diamond Bar when Patrick began thinking of retirement. Under their joint management, the ranch prospered, expanding its operations and incorporating the newest scientific methods of cattle breeding and range management. And on cold Wyoming nights, when the wind howled across the prairie and snow piled deep against the cabin walls, Catherine would often think back to that desperate night when her child had slept beside a dead fire until a cowboy lit a new one and sat guard till dawn. The memory no longer brought fear, but gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought Matthew Tucker into their lives at precisely the moment they needed him most. Sometimes, Life's greatest blessings come disguised as misfortunes. For Catherine and James Reed, a stagecoach robbery that had seemed like disaster had instead led them to their true home and the man who would complete their family. And for Matthew Tucker, a routine search for stray cattle had led him to the woman and child who would fill his life with love and purpose. Their story became part of Diamond Bar legend, passed down through generations of Tuckers who would continue to work the land and contribute to their community. And while the details might shift with each telling, the heart of the tale remained the same. How love could be found in the most unexpected places, and how a simple act of kindness could change lives forever. In the years that followed, Catherine and Matthew added 2 daughters and another son to their family. The cabin was expanded to accommodate their growing numbers, and laughter filled its rooms from dawn till dusk. James grew into a thoughtful young man who combined his stepfather's practical skills with his mother's love of learning, eventually attending the university in Denver before returning to help run the Diamond Bar. Through it all, Matthew and Catherine's love only deepened with time, weathering the inevitable challenges of ranch life with the same strength and determination that had brought them together that cold night under the Wyoming stars. And sometimes, on special occasions, Matthew would remind their children of how he had first met their mother and brother, a chance encounter in the wilderness that had changed everything. "Your mama was the bravest woman I'd ever seen," he would tell them, his arm around Catherine's shoulders, protecting her child beside that dead fire. "I just lit a new one and stood guard till dawn, but she lit something in me that's been burning ever since." Catherine would smile at his words, knowing that the fire he spoke of burned just as brightly in her own heart, a flame of love and hope that had guided them home.